Welcome to Clandestine Cases. The villagers of Havisham Green were used to the peculiarities of old men with money, but even the most gossipy among them hadn't expected the contents of Walter Havisham's will. The recluse of Hilltop Manor had died peacefully in his sleep, so it seemed. But when the will was read 3 days later in the drawing room of his ivy-clad estate, the entire gathering turned to stone. The bulk of Walter's estate, his sprawling manor, his lands, and a modest fortune in the bank, was not left to his two nieces, the prim and tight-lipped Clara and her younger sister Mabel, nor to his devoted housekeeper Mrs. Penrose, who had been with him for 30 years. Instead, it went to a name no one recognized, a Mr. Felix Harper. The solicitor, Mr. Ellicott, was equally bewildered. There was no address, no relation, no known connection. Just the name, typed neatly on the will with an almost smug clarity, Felix Harper. What made the entire matter spiral into mystery was not the will itself, but what followed it. That very night, after the will's contents had rippled through the village like a dropped stone in a still pond, the locked study at Hilltop Manor was broken into. The room had only one entrance, which Mrs. Penrose swore had been bolted from the inside when she had last cleaned it the day before. Yet sometime after dusk, the door had been forced. Walter's desk had been rifled through, papers were scattered, drawers pulled open, and a strange residue of ash was left in the fireplace as if someone had burned something in haste. But nothing, as far as anyone could tell, had been taken. No jewelry, no money, not even the rare books he was known to collect. Just one thing appeared different, a faded photograph that always sat on the mantel, Walter and his late brother as young men, was gone. The local constable, young and overwhelmed, scratched his head and took down statements with more confusion than conviction. There was no sign of forced entry on any windows, and the door, though battered now, had shown no marks on the inside. If it had been locked from within, how had anyone gotten in? And why burn documents in a house filled with people still grieving, or pretending to? Miss Marple heard of the affair the next morning during her routine walk to the grocer's. She didn't need more than 3 sentences from Mrs. Draycott to feel the usual tug of curiosity. A will naming a stranger, a sealed room entered without explanation, and a missing photograph. It was all far too untidy. And untidiness, she had long known, was rarely accidental. She arrived at Hilltop Manor unannounced later that afternoon, dressed in her soft grey coat and hat that gave her the look of a gentle cloud drifting in. Clara Havisham, pale and defensive, answered the door with narrowed eyes. "If you've come to gossip, Miss Marple," she began, but the elderly sleuth simply smiled and asked after Mrs. Penrose. It was the housekeeper who welcomed her in. Inside the drawing room nothing looked disturbed. It was too clean. Miss Marple noted how someone had taken care to polish the brass on the fireplace tools. Over-polishing, she thought, was a nervous habit. People clean things too much when they're trying to forget something. Mrs. Penrose poured tea with slightly shaking hands and said in hushed tones that no one in the house had ever heard of this Mr. Felix Harper. "He's not family. No one's ever visited the master except the solicitor and the postman. I don't know who he could be, but Miss Clara..." She was furious. Miss Marple nodded. She already suspected that Clara had expected to inherit everything. Cold daughters of stern men always do. But the curious thing was the photograph. Why take it? Not for money. Old family portraits hold no real value. Unless, of course, it wasn't just a portrait. Perhaps it had been a clue. A name forgotten, a face remembered. Later she made her way to the study, under the pretense of fetching a book Walter once lent her years ago. The door had been repaired hastily. Inside she ran a gloved hand along the edge of the mantel. No, dust. Recently cleaned. But as she looked up where the photo once stood, she noticed a faint rectangular outline on the wallpaper, darker where the frame had shielded it. She bent slightly and peered behind a nearby vase. A single torn corner of a photograph peeked out. She didn't touch it, not yet. Instead, she studied the fireplace. The ash was grey and fine, too fine for ordinary paper. It was the ash of photographic film, or old photo paper. And there was something metallic beneath the grate. Carefully, using the poker, she nudged it out. A small, half-melted frame. Its edges blackened but one brass corner still intact, with the name Harper Bros etched into the back. A photo studio mark. Miss Marple stood up, her eyes sharp now. Walter hadn't just burned a photo. Someone else had, or someone had wanted to ensure the photograph never revealed its secret. But why destroy something only to steal its twin from the mantel? Unless one was real and the other a forgery. She returned home before dusk, her mind whirring. The crime was not a crime, not in the traditional sense. No one had been killed, but someone had broken into a locked room, to erase a clue. Someone who knew that the name Felix Harper would ring no bells, and that a single photograph might unravel the mystery. The will had not been forged. The solicitor confirmed its validity. But the motive was clear. Either someone wanted to hide who Felix Harper really was, or someone wanted him to disappear completely. Miss Marple stared at the single torn corner in her handbag. It showed the edge of a sleeve. Not a modern cut. Perhaps military. That would be her next inquiry. Because in her experience, when a dead man names a stranger in his will, it is never by accident. And the most baffling puzzles often begin with the smallest pieces that refuse to fit. The following morning brought with it a grey mist that clung to the hedgerows of Havisham Green, softening the landscape but sharpening the whispers. News of the will and the name that no one knew had spread with the kind of fervour that small villages reserve for weddings, deaths, and scandals. Miss Marple stepped out with her usual measured gait, the hem of her coat brushing against dew-wet grass as she made her way toward the village post office. There, behind the counter, Mr. Peebles greeted her with a wary smile, aware that Miss Marple's presence often heralded complications disguised as conversations. She asked for a few stamps, idly inquired about any registered post sent recently to Hilltop Manor, and then, without looking up, murmured, "Do you recall a parcel, perhaps addressed to Mr. Felix Harper?" Mr. Peebles hesitated, then nodded faintly. "Last week, a small parcel. No return address, just initials. F.H. came from London, I think." Miss Marple's smile was gentle. "Thank you, Mr. Peebles. That may be rather helpful." By mid-afternoon, she returned to Hilltop Manor under the pretext of delivering a small tin of plum cake for Mrs. Penrose, who welcomed her with tired gratitude. Miss Marple's real interest, however, lay in observing the occupants of the house once more, now that the shock of the will had given way to calculation and, in some corners, resentment. Clara was in the conservatory, hands clasped tightly behind her back, as she paced among the hothouse flowers. She spoke in clipped phrases, avoiding Miss Marple's eyes. "I'm sure all this fuss will die down soon," she said coldly. "Uncle must have had his reasons. Perhaps the man helped him in the war. You know how secretive he was. But Mabel, whom Miss Marple found in the breakfast room stringing beads into a necklace, was less rehearsed. It doesn't make any sense. Uncle hated strangers. He didn't even like the milkman coming up the drive. If he trusted someone enough to leave them everything, we'd have known. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, noting how Mabel's fingers trembled only when she spoke Felix Harper's name. She asked casually whether Walter had any old photographs or letters tucked away, perhaps in boxes or albums. Mabel shook her head. He burned most of his papers last winter. Said the past was best left where it belonged. The next half hour passed in apparent idleness. Miss Marple took tea in the drawing room, commented on the wallpaper, and admired a rather stern-looking portrait of Walter's father. But her eyes moved constantly. On the windowsill was a flower pot, too new, too clean. She touched the soil, dry, though it had rained yesterday. When she lifted the pot, there was a faint smudge beneath, as if something had been hidden and then hastily removed. She said nothing, but a faint crease formed between her brows. In the hallway she paused by the study door. It remained locked, the constable having declared it part of the investigation. But from beneath the crack of the door, a faint scent still lingered, burnt paper and something else. Not quite chemical, but familiar. A memory surfaced from long ago of cleaning lamp chimneys with her aunt in St. Mary Mead, kerosene. Back. In the sitting room, she waited for the right moment. It came when Clara entered briskly to fetch a shawl and caught sight of Miss Marple examining a carved wooden box on the side table. Clara stiffened. "That's private," she said, moving quickly to close the lid. Miss Marple didn't press, but her attention now pivoted sharply to Clara's reaction. The box itself had contained little of note: old buttons, a dried sprig of lavender, a fountain pen without ink. But Clara had reacted as if it hid a secret worth guarding. That evening Miss Marple sat by her fire with the torn corner of the photograph beside her teacup. She had visited the library earlier and requested any records on Harper Bra, the name etched into the melted photo frame. The librarian had found an old directory, Harper Bra's studio, once located in Shoreditch, London. Closed during the Blitz, never reopened. A forgotten business. A forgotten name. Unless Walter hadn't forgotten. Unless the man in the will wasn't a stranger at all. She considered the odds. A solitary man names someone no one knows. A photograph is stolen and burned. A room is broken into but nothing taken, only destroyed. And now a daughter clings too tightly to an empty box, while another trembles at the mention of a name. Somewhere, in this knot, was a thread of truth. The next morning she returned once more, this time under the guise of collecting a shawl she'd left behind. Mrs. Penrose let her in, flustered. Clara had left early for the solicitor's office, and Mabel had taken to her room with a headache. Miss Marple wandered carefully. She stopped by the flower pot again. This time she lifted it, and underneath, embedded in the faint outline of disturbed dust, was a tiny scrap of wax-sealed paper, so small it could have been missed by anyone. Not looking closely, she carefully unfolded it. Most of it was singed, but 3 words remained visible. Felix, brother, promise. Miss Marple didn't need more than that. She understood now what others had missed. The photo had shown not just 2 young men, but twins perhaps, or close brothers, born of the same generation, not separated by distance but by silence. Walter Havisham had once had a brother. That much was known. But what if Felix hadn't died in the war, as the family believed? What if he'd simply disappeared, disowned, exiled, or erased? The will had not been the act of a senile old man. It had been a promise kept, a final reconciliation hidden from judgmental eyes. And someone, perhaps both nieces, had discovered that truth just in time to try and bury it again. But they had missed something. A keen eye never overlooks the misplaced, the unwatered flower pot, or the wrong reaction at the wrong time. Miss Marple smiled faintly. The name had seemed strange only because the story behind it had been buried long before the will was written. Now all she had to do was find out who else had known it, and who had been desperate enough to make it vanish again. The morning after her quiet discovery beneath the flower pot, Miss Marple sent a discreet note to Mr. Ellicott, requesting a brief word about Walter Havisham's will and any prior drafts it might have replaced. The solicitor, a serious man of orderly habits and mild discomfort around inquisitive elderly women, agreed to meet her at his office just before noon. He offered her a seat, poured her a cup of thin tea, and retrieved a slim folder from a locked drawer. There were 2 previous versions of the will, he explained, both dated over a decade ago. The earlier drafts left everything to Clara and Mabel in equal parts, with a modest provision for Mrs. Penrose. Mr. Harper's name never appeared until this final document signed 3 months ago. Mr. Havisham instructed me not to speak of it unless questioned directly. He said, "Some debts are old but must still be paid." Miss Marple nodded slowly, her suspicion deepening. She inquired gently, "Did Mr. Havisham seem confused during his final months?" Mr. Ellicott frowned. "Not at all. If anything, he became more focused. He specifically asked about the legalities of changing a will without informing his previous beneficiaries. He was very clear about that." She thanked him and stepped out into the chill of a late winter wind. Thoughts layered like the shawl. She drew closer around her. The change in the will had been deliberate, not the whim of a confused old man. Someone in the house had likely discovered that change and panicked. She returned to Hilltop Manor by early afternoon, under the pretext of discussing a donation Walter once made to the church roof fund. Clara was absent again, but Mabel sat listlessly in the parlor, picking at a hemline with frayed fingers. Miss Marple took a seat, waited a moment, then said, "I believe you found out about the new will before it was read." Mabel froze but said nothing. "You didn't tell your sister, did you?" The silence dragged a little too long. "No," she whispered eventually. "I thought he was bluffing. Uncle always threatened to disinherit us when we upset him. I found the letter Mr. Ellicott sent weeks ago. It was tucked in his desk. I didn't think he meant it. But someone else did," Miss Marple said gently. "Someone who went to great length to destroy a photograph, to erase a name, perhaps even tried to find Felix Harper before the will became public knowledge. Did you ever see Clara search the study before the break-in?" Mabel swallowed. "She was in there the day before the will reading. Said she was looking for her scarf, but I saw her with one of Uncle's ledgers. She was crying. That's not like Clara. She doesn't cry." Miss Marple thanked her and left her with a warm touch on the shoulder, heading for the kitchen where Mrs. Penrose was peeling potatoes at the table. The housekeeper looked worn but alert. "Strange thing," she murmured as Miss Marple poured herself some water. "The morning after the break-in, Clara came downstairs before anyone else, said she needed air, but when I went to clean the back hallway, the window latch had been forced from the outside, as if someone had used it, then tried to make it look like a break-in. I told the constable, but he just shrugged. "Did she take anything with her?" Miss Marple asked lightly. Mrs. Penrose thought for a moment. She had a bag, one of those large leather ones, heavy enough she used both hands. Said it was books. Miss Marple stayed a moment longer, then excused herself. The lies were beginning to surface, like weeds forced out of wet earth. Mabel had known about the will, but done nothing. Clara had found something in that study, something she couldn't allow to reach daylight. And someone, perhaps Clara herself, had staged a false break-in to conceal it. Her next visit was to the constable, who, though still flustered by the case, welcomed Miss Marple's company. She asked about the burnt documents and whether any had been recovered. "We found some fragments," he admitted. "Mostly unreadable. But one had a date, 1917. Looked like an old service document. The fire ruined most of it, though. That was enough." If Felix had been Walter's brother and had disappeared during or after the war, then a service record, perhaps dishonorable, perhaps hidden, might have been his only remaining trace. Someone had found it, someone had destroyed it, and now the only person who might know the truth was missing. That evening Miss Marple received a telegram delivered by bicycle. It had come from an old friend in London, a retired clerk who still had access to certain military archives. The message was brief. Felix Harper, Walter Havisham's brother, enlisted 1915, court-martialed 1917, discharged, vanished, records sealed. Miss Marple sat in her parlour, the fire crackling beside her. So Felix had not died in the war. He had disappeared in disgrace, erased from family history. But Walter had never forgotten. Perhaps in their final years, they had reconnected. A brother's shame weighed heavily, but it weighed less than a broken promise. She now understood what had been done, but not yet by whom. Clara had lied. Mabel had hidden the truth. Mrs. Penrose knew more than she said. And somewhere, in this house or out there in the village, someone had tried to keep Felix Harper buried with the past. But the past had an inconvenient habit of resurfacing, especially under the scrutiny of someone who noticed when flower pots were moved, when soil was dry, and when a tear was forced. Miss Marple tucked the telegram away and prepared her coat. She had one more conversation to conduct before the day ended. Not with Clara, nor with Mabel, but with the only person who had nothing to gain and everything to lose if the truth remained hidden. Someone who had served Walter loyally and perhaps knew of his final decision before anyone else. Mrs. Penrose had been at Hilltop Manor longer than both nieces, and loyalty, Miss Marple had learned, can be a disguise as much as a virtue. Miss Marple made her way back to Hilltop Manor with the soft persistence of falling snow. The telegram in her handbag weighed nothing, but in her mind it was heavy with implication. The truth about Felix Harper had not just been inconvenient. It had been shameful. A court-martial, a vanished brother, and a lifetime spent pretending he never existed. And now, long after most believed the past was dead and buried, the past had written itself into a will. The repercussions were spreading through the house, like quiet rot beneath floorboards. Mrs. Penrose was in the kitchen again, slicing bread with the mechanical rhythm of someone keeping her hands busy to silence the noise in her head. Miss Marple stepped into the warm air and sat without invitation, offering a pleasant smile. "I was thinking," she said gently, "that perhaps Walter didn't want his nieces to know about Felix." Mrs. Penrose's knife slowed. He didn't. He told you, didn't he? The housekeeper looked down at the crush she had mangled. A year ago. Mr. Harper came here late at night. I answered the door. He didn't say his name at first, but I knew. Same voice, same eyes, older, of course. Rougher. They spoke in the study for hours. I was asked to bring brandy and leave them. Miss Marple's voice was calm. And after, he came a few more times. They argued once. Badly. Then nothing for a while. But 3 months ago, Mr. Havisham changed his will. Said he couldn't undo the past, but he could at least acknowledge it. She shook her head. I don't know what happened between them during the war. But Mr. Havisham was different after. More withdrawn. The kind of guilt that clings to people, even when they pretend it doesn't. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. Did Clara know he had returned? No. But someone was watching. A letter arrived a week before the will was changed. No return address. Just one line. I know who's back. Mr. Havisham was shaken. Burned it in the fireplace. The pieces moved in her mind. A letter, unsigned. A frightened old man changing his will, a brother returned from disgrace, and someone, likely more than one person, determined to keep the inheritance in the family. But each motive splintered into smaller questions. Clara, whose bitterness toward her uncle had grown as his attention slipped from her. Mabel, meek and anxious, possibly hiding behind weakness. Mrs. Penrose, whose loyalty might have shifted into silent control. And then Felix himself. Where was he now? That evening, she walked through the garden paths behind the manor, her boots sinking into damp soil. She passed the greenhouse, and then the small gardener's shed beyond it. She paused. Something about the latch on the door looked off, recently forced, then poorly mended. She tugged gently, and it gave with a reluctant creak. Inside, it smelled of damp wood and stale tobacco. An overturned crate served as a stool. On it lay a faded scarf and a battered tin mug, the kind sold in army canteens long ago. He had stayed here. She turned slowly, eyes searching the walls. On a crooked nail hung a coat, one that didn't belong to any of the staff. She checked the pockets, empty save for a folded scrap of newspaper dated 2 months ago, circled around an article about inheritance fraud. Her breath caught. Felix had not simply visited. He had lingered, watched, perhaps even tried to intervene. The implications tangled deeper. Had Clara found him? Had she confronted her uncle? Had the burning in the fireplace been Walter's attempt to destroy the last evidence of his brother's return, or Clara's attempt to erase Felix entirely? Returning to the house, Miss Marple found Clara at last, seated in the study with the curtains drawn. She was sipping sherry, her posture composed, but her fingers twitched at odd intervals. Miss Marple closed the door behind her and sat without speaking. Clara broke first. If you've come to deliver a sermon about family bonds, save it. Not a sermon, Miss Marple said quietly. Just a thought. Your uncle changed his will because he believed he had betrayed someone. Clara's jaw tightened. He betrayed all of us the moment he let a criminal back into our lives, a man who disgraced the family. He stole from fellow soldiers, did you know that? Deserted his unit. You read his file. I found the envelope, she said flatly. I wasn't meant to. But once I knew, I couldn't let it go. I thought, perhaps if I showed Uncle what kind of man Felix really was, he'd come to his senses. But he didn't, Miss Marple said. No, he destroyed the papers and called me ungrateful. Miss Marple's voice was low. And you broke into the study the night before the will was read, to destroy what you thought might remain, to find something that could undo it. Clara didn't deny it. She stared ahead, glass clutched tight. I thought the photograph could be used to prove manipulation. Maybe it was a fake. Maybe the will had been coerced. I was desperate. Did you find Felix? No. I looked, but he vanished. Left that horrid coat and disappeared. Miss Marple rose. He may have left because he saw how unwelcome he truly was. She left Clara alone with her sherry and silence. The pieces had begun to form their pattern. Clara's motive was pride and fear, of scandal, of disgrace, of loss. Mabel's was inertia and dread. Mrs. Penrose's loyalty bent toward preservation. But still, the web had one empty space. Felix. Why had he returned only to vanish again? Why linger so near, then flee? That night Miss Marple sat by the fire, knitting forgotten in her lap. The newspaper scrap from the shed lay beside her teacup. An article about inheritance schemes. It had been circled. Why? Not out of guilt, but maybe out of warning. What if Felix hadn't fled? What if he had been removed? That thread, once pulled, would either unravel the whole thing, or finally reveal who was capable of doing more than just lying to protect a legacy. The following morning began with a flurry of activity. Constable Reeves, usually reluctant to involve himself too deeply in matters he privately considered domestic entanglements, arrived at Hilltop Manor with a determined expression and a folded statement clutched in his hand. Miss Marple, who had just finished her tea in the drawing-room, observed the interaction from the hallway unseen. Clara stood stiffly near the study doorway, arms crossed, as the constable cleared his throat and addressed her with an official air. "It seems," he said, "that we found something of importance. A local boy delivering milk near the East Gate 3 nights ago says he saw a man, scruffy, limping, leave the property carrying a small satchel. He identified him from a photograph. Said it was the same man posted on the old registry board at the town hall from years ago. Felix Harper." Clara said nothing at first. Then slowly she asked, "And what's become of him?" "We tracked him to an inn outside Little Marchford," the constable said proudly. "He left a few days ago, left no name. But the innkeeper recalled the coat and the limp. That's when I remembered the one we found in the gardener's shed. Same description. He's on the move. Likely ran after finding out the will was going public. Can't say I blame him. Probably worried he'd be accused of coercion." Mrs. Penrose emerged from the kitchen with a pale face, wiping her hands on her apron, and Mabel hovered nearby. For a moment it seemed like the entire household held its breath. The constable continued. "Based on this and the confirmed identity from the photograph, we'll be closing the case from our end. Nothing criminal to pursue. Mr. Harper was clearly acknowledged in the will. No evidence of foul play. Just unfortunate timing." Miss Marple stepped into the room at last, hands folded gently over her handbag. "You're quite certain, Constable?" she asked, voice mild. Reeves nodded. "Everything lines up. The man disappeared, yes, but he left behind his belongings. No signs of a struggle, no signs of foul play." said Miss Marple, and said nothing else. Later, as the house quieted, and Reeves left with the satisfied air of a man finishing a task he didn't enjoy, Miss Marple sat with Mrs. Penrose in the warmth of the kitchen. The housekeeper looked down at her hands. "He's not coming back, is he?" Miss Marple didn't answer directly. "It's interesting, isn't it," she said, "that the boy mentioned a limp. Felix's military records didn't note any leg injury, and if he had a limp severe enough to be remembered, wouldn't that have been the first thing Walter recognized after all these years?" Mrs. Penrose looked up sharply. "You think the boy was mistaken?" "I think," said Miss Marple slowly, "that sometimes when someone wants a mystery to go away, they find the nearest explanation and force everything to fit around it." Mrs. Penrose stood and busied herself at the sink. "It's done now," she murmured. "The constable's satisfied. Clara gets the house, Mabel will have her share, and Mr. Harper, whoever he really was, has vanished again." Miss Marple studied the woman's back. "You know he didn't leave of his own accord." Room grew very still. Then, a small clink of porcelain as Mrs. Penrose placed a cup on the counter too firmly. That afternoon, Miss Marple walked the grounds again, not out of habit this time, but with clear purpose. She paused near the gardener's shed once more, then moved toward the edge of the property, where the tree line thickened into the narrow path that led to the river. Years ago, it had been used by groundskeepers and deliverymen, now overgrown with thorny brambles. Near a hollow tree stump, she crouched. The soil was disturbed. Not a recent grave, no. Nothing so grim. But something had been buried. She found a broken flask, half crushed, and next to it, a folded scrap of waxed paper containing matches and a stub of wax pencil. She opened it. Faded handwriting. "He doesn't know I'm here. We'll wait until he sleeps. If not safe, burn this." Her heart beat faster. Someone had hidden here, possibly watched the house, possibly waited, and then either ran or was forced to run. She returned to the house at dusk, where she found Mabel in the drawing room, absent-mindedly sewing a button onto a dress that didn't need repair. Miss Marple asked gently, "Did Felix ever speak?" "To you?" Mabel blinked. "I never saw him. But he left the shed in a hurry. Took almost nothing. Left behind a coat, a mug, a newspaper clipping. Why would someone so determined to reclaim his identity run without the will itself? Or even a letter from Walter confirming the change?" "I don't know," Mabel said, her voice thin. Miss Marple watched her for a long moment. "You once said Clara doesn't cry. But you've been crying, haven't you?" Mabel said nothing, but her hands stilled. "I found signs of someone watching the house from the woods. I believe Felix waited there, uncertain whether he would be welcomed or attacked. And when he did approach, perhaps he never made it inside. Perhaps someone intercepted him." Mabel rose quickly. "You don't know that?" "No," Miss Marple said, "but I know Clara staged the break-in, and I know someone with a limp walked away from this house dressed in Felix's coat. A coat he left behind." Mabel turned toward the window, her shoulders trembling. "She said it was for the best. She said Uncle had gone mad naming him. She said it would ruin everything, the inheritance, our name, the house." Miss Marple stood, her voice low but clear. "Did she hurt him, Mabel?" "I don't know," Mabel whispered. "He came to the house. I saw her speaking to him through the gate. He looked tired. She gave him something. Then he left." Miss Marple's breath caught. She gave him something. A flask. I thought it was water. But later she burned the cup he drank from. Wouldn't even let me touch it. It was enough. The flask by the tree line. The note that suggested waiting. And now, a drink that had to be destroyed. The authorities had been eager to tie the loose ends together. A limping stranger seen leaving town, a coat and satchel abandoned. But Miss Marple knew too well. When answers arrive too conveniently, they are often placed, not found. Felix Harper had returned to reclaim what was his, not out of greed, but out of longing for closure. Someone had made certain that closure was denied. The case, it seemed, had been declared solved. But the truth, like Felix, was still out there, silent, waiting, and unfinished. Miss Marple had no intention of letting it rest, not when a lie had just won its first false victory. The following morning brought a hush to Hilltop Manor, as though the house itself was holding its breath. The constable had moved on, satisfied with his conclusions, and Clara walked the halls with the composed grace of someone reclaiming control. The inheritance, the estate, the silence, she believed all of it hers now. But Miss Marple sat quietly in the sunlit breakfast room, studying an old volume of Walter Havisham's journals, found tucked behind a row of gardening ledgers in the study. Most of the pages were filled with mundane notations: weather, crop, yield, appointments with tradesmen. But one entry, dated almost 35 years earlier, had caught her eye. June 6th. Felix has gone again. We argued. I told him he would not be welcome in this house until he made peace with the truth. He said the truth had been rewritten without him. I locked the drawer. If anyone finds it, it will ruin more than just a name. Miss Marple had spent the evening reflecting on the wording. The drawer. Not a metaphor. Walter had been literal, methodical. And ruin, more than just a name, suggested something larger than a family quarrel or a wartime disgrace. She returned to the study early before the others stirred and examined the desk with fresh purpose. In the bottom right corner, behind the central panel, she felt a ridge, a thin, nearly invisible slit along the wood's edge. With the tip of a letter opener, she pried gently until a false panel lifted out of place. Inside, she found a slim leather-bound booklet and a folded document. The booklet was a bank ledger, not Walter's, Felix's, from a small, now defunct bank in Brighton. The transactions were sparse but steady, ending abruptly in 1917. The document was harder to decipher, a typed letter bearing the seal of a private legal firm. It was a witness statement sworn by Felix Harper during a military tribunal. And it told a very different story. Contrary to the family law, Felix had not deserted. He had refused to follow an illegal order, an execution without trial. He had reported his superior only to be court-martialed in retaliation. The disgrace was manufactured, the silence enforced. Walter, upon hearing the report, had believed the accusations and cut all ties. Only years later did he uncover the truth. But by then Felix had vanished from official life. The letter was dated 1946, addressed to Walter, unopened. Miss Marple sat back in the chair, fingers tightening on the armrest. The past wasn't a shadow trailing behind this family. It was the very soil from which everything now grew. The will, the resentment, the false break-in, the convenient disappearance. Clara hadn't just feared scandal, she had feared exposure. Because if Felix was vindicated, then Walter's legacy of silence, Clara's inherited reputation, and the foundation of their social standing would all begin to crack. She needed one more thread, one person who could confirm what the letter had begun to suggest. She took a quiet walk to the far end of the village and paid a visit to Edith Longley, once a nurse, now retired, and sharp as ever. She had served in the local infirmary during the 1950s, and Miss Marple had reason to believe her memory remained formidable. "Felix Harper," she asked after the pleasantries, "does the name mean anything to you?" Edith paused only briefly. "Not the name. But I do remember a man, a recluse, lived under an assumed name near the cliffs outside Little Marchford. Had a leg injury, though he never spoke of it. I treated him once for pneumonia. This would have been 53. He always said he'd had a brother in Havisham Green, a mistake between them that couldn't be undone." Miss Marple listened closely. "Do you recall what name he used?" "Martin Ellis. But I always suspected it wasn't his real name. He read law books constantly, and once he quoted something about false testimony outliving the truth. Strange man, sad eyes. It all fit. Felix had lived hidden, burdened by silence, quietly nursing the wound of a ruined reputation. And Walter, discovering the truth late, had tried, perhaps clumsily, to make amends by restoring what little he could. But Felix, once hopeful, had been met again by rejection and manipulation. Returning to Hilltop Manor, Miss Marple found Clara alone in the study, seated where Walter once had written his thoughts. The sunlight fell on her face in stark angles, illuminating the rigidity of her expression. Miss Marple laid the letter and ledger on the desk between them. "I found these behind the drawer Walter mentioned in his journals. You remember, the drawer, the one that could ruin more than a name." Clara stared at the items but made no move to touch them. Her face remained still. "You knew," Miss Marple said quietly. "You found the drawer before I did. You read the letter. You understood that if Felix came forward, he wouldn't just inherit a fortune. He would inherit back the honor you believed belonged solely to this family." Clara's voice was barely a whisper. "He would have undone everything. People would ask questions. They'd look into my father, into my uncle's silence, our name, our standing. So you gave him the flask," Miss Marple continued. "Something to ease his nerves, you said. At least with something, enough to weaken him, to confuse him. And when he collapsed outside the shed, or in the woods, you took what you needed to make it look like he'd fled. His coat, his satchel, enough to build a story." Clara's breath caught. "You didn't kill him," Miss Marple added. "I don't think that was your intent, but you made sure he couldn't return. You told no one. You left him in the cold." There was no dramatic outburst, just a quiet crumbling in Clara's composure, like a statue cracking beneath time's weight. "I wanted him to leave," she said finally. "That was all." "But he didn't," Miss Marple replied, rising slowly. "And the land outside. This house may yet tell us where he truly is." She turned toward the door, her voice now carrying the chill of truth finally uncovered. "The past, Miss Havisham, does not stay buried. Not when it was never dead to begin with." By the time the afternoon sun had dipped behind the skeletal branches of the manor's orchard, Miss Marple had arranged everything precisely. The discovery in the hidden drawer had confirmed the truth, but truth alone wasn't enough. Clara Havisham had not confessed in full. She had admitted to wanting Felix gone, but had carefully skirted any acknowledgement of intent. There remained a veil of respectable detachment in her voice, as if her actions had been an unfortunate but rational solution. Miss Marple had heard that tone before, from those who believe that morality is a currency reserved for those with nothing to lose. But Clara had something to lose, and Miss Marple intended to press exactly where it hurt. She invited Mabel to a tea first. The younger niece was pale and brittle, and though she tried to maintain the composed bearing of her sister, it was clear she was unraveling. Miss Marple laid out a tray in the drawing-room, sponge cake, warm milk, and a carefully folded envelope placed conspicuously beside the teapot. "What's that?" Mabel asked, eyeing it with visible tension. "Oh, just something the solicitor dropped off this morning," Miss Marple said lightly. "A revised affidavit. Something about reversing the will due to fraud. It will take a few more weeks. But the courts seem very interested now that Mr. Harper's testimony has been found." Mabel's hand twitched. "Testimony?" Miss Marple gave her a kindly smile. "Yes. It turns out Mr. Harper kept a detailed written record of his correspondence with your uncle. It's been authenticated. Apparently he feared foul play, kept duplicates. Imagine that." Mabel looked as if she might be sick. "But he's gone, isn't he? That's the thing, dear. He never left the grounds." Miss Marple said it in a tone so soft, so gentle, it barely rose above the clink of china. Mabel's spoon paused halfway to the sugar bowl. Her lips parted as if to ask a question, then closed again. Miss Marple watched her carefully, not for words, but for what she couldn't contain. After Mabel excused herself with a feeble smile, Miss Marple waited only a moment before rising. She walked straight to Clara's sitting room, where Clara was seated at the writing desk, making entries in what appeared to be a new household ledger. She did not look up. "I just spoke to your sister," Miss Marple said, voice even. "She's worried. She thinks the police might return." Clara did not look up. "They won't. The case is closed." "Oh, it was," Miss Marple said, sitting opposite her. "But something rather strange has occurred. You see, I took one of the cups from the gardener's shed, the one your sister said you burned." Clara's pen stopped moving. "I had it tested." Clara looked up at last. Her expression did not betray fear, but something else. Annoyance. As if Miss Marple were a housefly she couldn't swat. "Did you really, Miss Marple?" "Oh, yes," Miss Marple said cheerfully. "There were traces of laudanum. Quite a bit, actually. Enough to sedate a man severely. Now, laudanum isn't easy to come by these days, but the village pharmacist told me someone purchased a vial several weeks ago using a name that turned out to be false. The handwriting, however, matched perfectly with a list I found in the kitchen. One of your lists, I believe, for winter pantry stocks." Clara set down her pen carefully. "And what precisely do you intend to do with this information?" "That depends," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "You see, I think Mr. Harper didn't die. I think he awoke sometime later, groggy, confused, and too weak to climb back toward the manor. But I also think someone followed him. Someone who found his coat, removed the will, and then made a decision. You have no proof of that?" "No," Miss Marple agreed. "But I do have a letter." She reached into a handbag and pulled out an envelope. Not the one shown to Mabel, but another, this one far older. The paper was yellowed at the edges, the handwriting unmistakably Walter's. She passed it across the table. Clara stared at it but didn't touch it. "I found it among Felix's belongings in the shed. It was written after their first meeting, but never sent. In it, Walter confesses to everything. The mistake, the guilt, his intention to leave the estate to Felix, not out of charity, but justice. He names you, Clara. Says he feared how you might react. That he worried your ambition would outweigh your loyalty. Clara's fingers flexed once against the tabletop, then stilled again. She said nothing. I left that letter on the windowsill this morning by the open kitchen door. Miss Marple continued, her tone still calm. I thought perhaps Mabel might see it. Clara's composure broke. Not through words or denial, but through a sudden rush of breath, a blink too fast, a stiffening in her spine that was too sharp to hide. Miss Marple leaned forward. You see, Clara, guilt leaves marks, not on paper, but in action. You made a mistake. You trusted your sister would stay silent. But Mabel has started to speak in fragments. And I assure you, soon those fragments will connect. Clara's lips parted. She won't say anything. She already has. Miss Marple said softly. Enough to cast doubt. Enough to open an inquiry. And now, with that letter and the contents of Felix's journal, yes, I found that too. It will be enough. For the first time, Clara's face lost its poise. Her hand twitched toward the envelope as though she might snatch it and burn it, but her fingers curled back. Miss Marple stood gathering her bag. You won't be arrested today, perhaps not even tomorrow, but the truth has a way of catching up, Miss Havisham. It's like laudanum, slow, silent, and inescapable once inside the system, and I believe your time is running out. As Miss Marple walked down the corridor, she passed Mabel at the top of the stairs. The younger woman's face was pale, her expression unreadable. I don't know what to do, she whispered. Miss Marple gave her a gentle nod. Tell the truth. It's the only thing that has nowhere to hide. The next morning began with a hollow quiet that Miss Marple didn't trust. The manor was too still, too orderly, as if the house itself had braced for confrontation and found, instead, only avoidance. Mabel had not appeared for breakfast, and Clara, according to Mrs. Penrose, had taken a walk alone along the eastern path shortly after dawn. Miss Marple lingered in the sitting room, waiting for the post. Though she suspected, it was not a letter that would mark this day, but something far less visible. By mid-morning she made her way back to the study, intending to collect the letter Walter had written, left folded neatly the day before just where she had placed it on the edge of the desk. But it was gone. The surface was freshly dusted, unnaturally so, as if someone had wiped away not just fingerprints, but memory. Miss Marple searched the waste bin first, empty. Then the fireplace, cold ashes, undisturbed. She checked the bookshelf behind the desk, the drawers, even the folded throw on the armchair nearby. Nothing. The letter had vanished. She stepped into the hallway and found Mrs. Penrose dusting the banister. Has anyone been in the study this morning? The housekeeper hesitated only slightly. Miss Clara was in there around 8, just for a few minutes. Miss Marple nodded, hiding the tightening in her chest. Clara knew. Of course she knew. If she hadn't taken the letter yesterday in the quiet aftermath of their conversation, she had taken it this morning, perhaps fearing Mabel might finally open her mouth. That letter had been the one unmovable truth, Walter's own voice, his final confession. And now it was gone. The rest of the day passed in small silences. Miss Marple remained near the hearth, listening to the ticking of the long case clock. In the hallway, counting the hours she could not afford to lose, Mabel appeared just before luncheon, her eyes red, her hands trembling slightly. She avoided Miss Marple's gaze at first, but eventually sat across from her at the table. I tried to look for it, she whispered. The letter, I thought, If I showed it to the constable, but it's gone. I swear I didn't take it. I believe you, Miss Marple said gently. Mabel's eyes brimmed. She's hiding everything. She told me it would all blow over, that no one would believe. May if I spoke out now. She said I was too delicate to get involved. But I think something worse happened. I don't think Felix ever left the property at all. Miss Marple reached across the table and gently covered Mabel's hand. You're right. I believe he tried to leave, but he never made it far. And now Clara's trying to erase every trace of him. But you've remembered something else, haven't you? Mabel didn't answer immediately. Then, in a whisper, the shed key. Clara had it for 2 days before the will was read. She said she was cleaning out the tool shelves, but it's not like her. She never touches the garden. And after the day she argued with Uncle, she kept checking the back stairs at night, like she was expecting someone, or afraid someone might appear. Miss Marple leaned back slightly, her thoughts beginning to align once more. The shed, the note in the woods, the altered cup, and now a stolen letter. Clara was tightening the circle, wiping out every remaining thread, perhaps fearing Mabel would finally turn against her. The question now wasn't just whether Clara had silenced Felix, but whether she had planned every step since his arrival, anticipating exactly how much she could afford to destroy before anyone else caught up. That afternoon, Miss Marple returned to the village and met again with Mr. Ellicott, the solicitor. She asked if he'd received any follow-up from the courts about the will or the affidavit she had mentioned the day before. He frowned. That's odd. I sent the documents through the courier yesterday morning, but this morning I received a call. They never arrived. The envelope was tampered with, or so the clerk believes. Contents missing. Her heart sank. Do you recall where the courier stopped along the way? He consulted his notepad. Havisham Green Post Depot, then a brief delivery to Hilltop Manor. Some older records Clara requested, so Clara had intercepted them. It wasn't just the letter in the study. She had now cut off the legal trail too. Miss Marple thanked him and walked slowly back to the manor. A thin fog had begun to descend, curling low along the grass like smoke from a candle just blown out. When she returned, she found Mabel seated in the conservatory, clinging to a cushion, like it might steady her nerves. I need your help, Miss Marple said softly. Mabel looked up, startled. She has taken everything that can prove the truth. The letter, the ledger, the cup. Now the affidavit has vanished en route to the courts. If we wait longer, there may be nothing left. Mabel's lips trembled. What can I do? You remember the journal Felix kept? The one he brought in his satchel? I saw it once. It was small, bound in red cloth. Do you know where she put it? Mabel nodded. She hid it. I watched her late one night, creeping toward the old linen cupboard behind the staircase. She opened the panel beneath the lowest shelf. It's hollow underneath. Miss Marple touched her arm lightly. Then we must retrieve it before she returns. They waited until dusk, when Clara had taken her usual walk to the orchard. Mabel led her to the cupboard, heart pounding. The panel was stiff but yielded under pressure. Inside, dust swirled in stale air. And there, wrapped in an old handkerchief, was a small red book. Miss Marple opened it. The first page bore Felix's name. The next several pages were filled with dated entries. His thoughts after reuniting with Walter, his doubts, his fears. One passage stood out. She saw me tonight. I was foolish, approached too early. She was waiting. Gave me a drink. I felt dizzy. Said she would explain everything. But something is wrong. I am hiding in the shed. If I don't wake up, someone should know. I never asked for the inheritance. Only for my name back, Miss Marple. Closed the journal and stood, her expression hardening with quiet resolve. Now, she said, we can begin again. Not with assumptions or lies, but with Felix's voice, the one thing she cannot steal. But as they stepped into the hallway, the air suddenly changed. A breeze rushed past. The front door had been opened, too early for Clara's return. Mabel froze. Miss Marple turned sharply and whispered, "Hide the book. Now she's not alone." Miss Marple barely had time to signal before Mabel darted behind the staircase, clutching the red journal to her chest. Miss Marple turned, stepping calmly into the hallway as the front door swung fully open. A gust of evening air carried in the scent of damp earth, and then Clara entered, not alone. Beside her stood a man in a tan overcoat and gloves, eyes sharp beneath a tilted hat. He was unfamiliar, and yet his presence rang with a quiet authority. "This is Mr. Braithwaite," Clara said coolly, slipping off her gloves. "He's with the family solicitor's firm. I asked him to review the situation in light of all the recent interference." Miss Marple greeted him politely, her expression composed. "Interference is such a strong word, isn't it?" Clara said with an arched brow. "Someone's been going through private drawers, making wild accusations, inviting the village to speculate on family matters best left alone. Mr. Braithwaite cleared his throat. "Miss Havisham has informed me that a campaign of harassment has been occurring. She believes it may be rooted in a misunderstanding of her uncle's will and his recent state of mind." Miss Marple smiled softly, almost pityingly. "I'm afraid there is no misunderstanding. The confusion lies only in how far some have gone to ensure no one asks questions." Clara's eyes flicked toward the staircase for just a moment. A fraction too long. She hadn't seen Mabel, but she knew something had shifted. Miss Marple watched the tension ripple in the room. The way Clara's hand hovered a little too long on the sideboard. How her gaze avoided the study door. "I'll leave you to speak with Mr. Braithwaite," Miss Marple said, turning toward the stairs. "I must check on Mrs. Penrose. She hasn't been quite herself today." Clara's eyes narrowed, but she said nothing. Upstairs, Miss Marple found Mabel tucked into the far end of the corridor, the journal hidden beneath a pillow in one of the unused guest rooms. Her face was pale but determined. "He brought someone," Mabel whispered. "Yes," Miss Marple said, "but not to examine the will, to close the door on it." They waited until Mr. Braithwaite had taken tea and left, reassured by Clara's poised explanations. Miss Marple watched him from the parlor window, noting how he didn't speak a word once he'd stepped outside, just offered a firm nod, and climbed into his motorcar. Clara passed the threshold minutes later, standing in the open doorway, face half-shadowed by dusk. "Stay out of the study," she said evenly. "This is your last warning." That night, as the household retired, Miss Marple penned a short message and handed it to Mabel. "Post this at first light, directly to Mr. Ellicott's personal address. We can't risk it going missing again." Then she lay awake, listening. Not to the usual creaks of the manor or the rustle of wind through glass, but to the shift of steps on the staircase, the opening of a door, the faint click of something being moved. Clara wasn't sleeping. She was hunting. Just after midnight, a scream pierced the stillness. Miss Marple rose at once, slippers on her feet before she registered them. The sound had come from the back of the house, near the study. By the time she reached the hallway, Mabel was already there, wide-eyed and shaking. Mrs. Penrose was behind her in a dressing gown, clutching the banister with white-knuckled hands. They followed the sound together. The study door stood open now, lamplight flickering wildly within. Clara was on her knees beside the hearth, staring at something on the floor with a frozen, unnatural stillness. Miss Marple stepped closer, then stopped. On the carpet lay a man. It wasn't Felix, too young, clean-shaven. A courier's satchel lay beside him, torn at the strap, contents spilled, papers, envelopes, stamps. His uniform bore the insignia of the Regional Postal Service. A sharp scent clung to the air, chemical, burnt sugar, bitter and metallic. Clara's voice, when it came, was almost unrecognizable. He broke in. I found him here. I think he was stealing the ledger. I tried to stop him. I didn't touch him. I didn't. Miss Marple stepped around the body, careful not to disturb anything. The man's pulse had stopped, but there were no signs of a struggle, no visible injury. Just a trail of blood at the corner of his mouth, and the wide, vacant stare of someone taken by surprise. She looked to the hearth. The grate was scorched, the poker still glowing faintly red. Nearby, a small glass vial lay shattered. She picked up the stopper with a handkerchief. There was a residue clinging to the edge. He wasn't stealing anything, Miss Marple said softly. He was delivering something. He must have had duplicates, perhaps from Mr. Ellicott. And you were waiting. Clara stood slowly. You think I killed him? That I'd poisoned a stranger? I think you didn't expect him to know what he was delivering, or to open the package before reaching me. The constable arrived an hour later, roused from bed and flushed with urgency. He questioned everyone separately, but Miss Marple already knew what his conclusion would be. The vial would be sent for testing. The courier's identification was found tucked in his coat. His instructions had been to deliver a parcel to Miss Marple, marked urgent, private. He had never made it. Clara wept. But Miss Marple watched her carefully and knew those tears came, not from grief but from calculation slipping out of control. The investigation was reopened by necessity, but now it was no longer about a missing man. It was about a death that had occurred under witness, with no clear cause and too many possibilities. And worse, for Clara at least, it had not gone according to plan. Because whoever had helped her keep the truth buried was no longer useful. And now, the game had shifted. Miss Marple stood by the window again that night, watching the darkness press against the glass. Someone was trying to erase Felix Harper. Had tried again tonight. But now, with a second body and questions swirling faster than answers could be suppressed, the noose would begin to close. The villain was still ahead, but for the first time, they'd made a mistake, and she would not let it pass. The house had not slept. After the constable's men arrived and the body was removed, there had been endless murmurs, paperwork, footprints on clean floors, and questions that Clara parried with mechanical grace. But Miss Marple remained still throughout, seated by the drawing-room hearth as if waiting for the silence to return. It wasn't just the crime, it was the shift. Clara was unraveling, and the layers she had kept so tightly controlled were beginning to pull apart at the seams. By morning, the fog clung low to the garden paths, casting everything in a shroud of unease. Mabel sat at the far end of the breakfast table, barely touching her tea. Mrs. Penrose moved like a ghost, avoiding eye contact. And Clara was gone again. this time claiming to have gone to meet Mr. Braithwaite to resolve any outstanding matters. Miss Marple stood and walked toward the study, which had been left sealed with police tape. But she wasn't after the room. Her fingers trailed along the corridor's edge until she reached the tall cabinet opposite the stairwell. It was an old filing unit, once used for storing linens and candle stubs, but a narrow gap between the cabinet's base and the floorboards caught her attention again. Something she had noticed during her earliest days in the manor, and forgotten until now. She knelt and reached carefully under the base with a gloved hand. After a few moments of slow feeling, her fingers closed around a soft edge. Paper, folded tightly. She drew it out and stood, unfolding it with care. It was a list, scribbled hastily on notepaper torn from the kitchen ledger. Not Clara's hand, this was messier, slanted, almost childlike. A list of names and times, deliveries, shifts. One entry stood out. Jan, parcel left in tool drawer, shed, seesaw. Clara. Miss Marple narrowed her eyes. This note hadn't been meant for her, nor the constable. It had been left for someone else. Instructions or a warning? Perhaps both. But what struck her most was the word tool drawer, not the shed itself. The drawer. She crossed the rear corridor and stepped into the morning light, moving toward the garden shed. She unlocked it. Mrs. Penrose had given her the spare key after the first break-in, and moved to the battered workbench in the far corner. Below it, built into the bench's underside, was a wide drawer crusted with rust and disuse. She pulled it open, tools, wire, and at the back, wedged beneath a chisel, a small black-bound booklet, not much thicker than a pocket Bible, Felix's second journal. She opened it. The pages were erratic, scratched in places, hurried and emotional. There were entries about Walter, yes, but also others, observations about the household, Clara's movements, Mabel's whispers. Most startling was a page nearly torn through at the middle. Saw her again tonight. She knows. She's watching the study after dusk. Don't drink what she gives. Don't argue. Just act like it's all forgotten. Below that, if I'm gone, it's not because I left. I was here. Remember that. Miss Marple turned and stepped out. Into the garden, the journal clutched tightly in her hand. The courier's death, the missing affidavit, the destroyed cup, all of it had been built on the assumption that Felix was a threat to the inheritance. But what if that wasn't the full story? What if Felix had known more than Walter ever admitted? Back in the house, she found Mabel in the conservatory and placed the journal in front of her. "He didn't just come for justice," she said, quietly. "He came because he saw something, and he was trying to leave proof behind." Mabel flipped through the pages slowly, breath catching when she reached the torn entry. "He didn't trust her," she said, voice hollow. "No, and neither should you." Mabel's eyes rose. "There's more, isn't there?" Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, and I think I've just realized what it is. Something that's been in front of me this entire time." She moved briskly back to the study, pulled back the corner of the rug beneath the window. The floorboards creaked faintly. One plank had a clean split through its center, a mark she had noticed earlier, but dismissed as wear. She knelt, pushed, gently. It gave slightly, then lifted. Beneath it, a shallow compartment. Empty, save for one item, a silver lighter engraved with initials. R.H., not Felix, not Walter. Someone else. She rose, heart ticking faster. It wasn't the object. It was the detail. The engraving. The initials were familiar. Weeks ago, she'd seen a donation ledger at the church while attending a winter fundraiser. Walter had donated, under 3 initials, WH, FH, and once RH, 3 brothers. She returned to her room, retrieved the older version of the will that Mr. Ellicott had shown her briefly before. Sure enough, in the margin of the first draft, a note in Walter's own hand. To be split in thirds, unless R remains absent, beyond 1955. She moved to her notebook and flipped back through her observations. Mrs. Penrose had once mentioned that Walter had no remaining siblings. But she also noted a strange comment, how they'd buried all the family quarrels long ago. Not it, there had been a third Havisham brother. And then it clicked. The parcels, the forged courier rotes, the sudden appearance of Mr. Braithwaite without formal request. The way Clara had always seemed a step ahead, even when Miss Marple uncovered something privately. She had a partner. She returned to the ledger in the study and flipped it open. In the margin of one page was a familiar handwriting, slanted, uneven, like the note found behind the filing cabinet. The same hand. A second conspirator. One who had been helping her. Erase Felix, not Mabel, not the solicitor, not a stranger. She looked at the writing again, and slowly, terribly, she recognized it. Mrs. Penrose, of course. The one who had stayed through every argument, who had watched Walter's health fade, who had known Felix had returned, who had access to every drawer, every key, every cup of tea, and every fireplace in which evidence had been quietly turned to ash. Miss Marple closed the ledger slowly. The pattern was complete now. The will hadn't been just a disruption. It had been a threat to a quiet alliance, one buried in the rhythm of habit and the silence of long service. Clara had supplied the motive. But Mrs. Penrose, she had supplied the means. And if Miss Marple's instincts were right, they hadn't made their final move yet. Because now that the pattern was visible, it was only a matter of time before one of them tried to break it. The house, for all its grandeur, felt smaller now. Each hallway Miss Marple walked carried the weight of secrets packed too tightly between the walls. It wasn't just the theft of a name, the silencing of a man, or even the death of a messenger. It was something older, deeper, an illness grown, quietly beneath years of duty, loyalty, and unspoken resentment. The pattern had pointed the way. But now, she had to confront its origin. That evening, she found Mrs. Penrose in the kitchen, rinsing the same teacup for the second time. The housekeeper didn't look up as Miss Marple entered, only asked in a flat tone, "More tea?" "No, thank you," Miss Marple replied, stepping closer. "I was thinking of something you once said, that all the family quarrels had been buried long ago." Mrs. Penrose didn't react at first. Then she placed the cup on the drying rack, carefully wiped her hands, and turned. "I suppose I did say that. You didn't mean Walter and Clara. You meant Walter and his brothers, all 3 of them." Mrs. Penrose's expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes did. A flicker. Not quite fear, but awareness. Miss Marple continued gently. "Felix wasn't the youngest, was he? There was another. Richard. The quiet one. He stayed out of the family feuds. Went away, early, but Walter still left him a share in the first draft of the will. You knew that, because he was yours, wasn't he?" The silence that followed was total. Even the ticking clock above the stove seemed to pause. Mrs. Penrose blinked once. Slowly. "E was mine," she said at last, voice low, "not by birth but by bond. Richard had no one but me. You were his wife." The words weren't a question, and Mrs. Penrose didn't deny them. "We married in secret. Walter never approved, said it would disgrace the family name, a housekeeper and a Havisham. Richard never wanted the inheritance. He wanted peace. So he left. But when he died, I returned. Walter was older, slower. He barely remembered half the wrongs he'd done. But I remembered all of them." Miss Marple listened, unmoving. The pieces settled into place now with terrifying clarity. "You took the job here to be close to the estate." Mrs. Penrose nodded faintly. "I thought I could let it go. I thought time would smooth it. But when Felix came back, when Walter began changing the will, speaking of justice, I knew it wasn't for Richard. It was for himself, for his guilt. He was trying to cleanse his conscience, not honor the dead. And Clara, well, Clara didn't care about truth, only legacy. So you aligned. She needed someone who could act quietly. Someone who knew the grounds, who could burn a letter before it was seen, who could dose a cup without suspicion. I gave her that." Miss Marple's voice was soft but sharp. "And in return, she promised to protect your silence. She promised Richard's name wouldn't be dragged out and buried again. That was all I asked. And Felix." Mrs. Penrose's lips tightened. "He was digging, asking about Richard. I don't think he meant harm, but he would have exposed everything. My marriage, Clara's grip on the estate, Walter's hypocrisy. I tried to warn him. He wouldn't listen." Miss Marple stared at her, sadness etched deep in her features. "So you let him drink the laudanum?" "I didn't kill him," Mrs. Penrose said firmly. "He left the shed. I saw him disappear into the woods. I don't know what happened after, but when Clara brought back his coat and said it was done, I didn't ask. But you helped silence him. I preserved peace." "No," Miss Marple said quietly, "you preserved control. You took what Richard never wanted and buried everything he stood for." The door behind them creaked. Mabel stood in the frame, her face pale and wet with tears. She had heard every word. "I trusted you," she whispered. "You were like family." Mrs. Penrose closed her eyes. "You were a child. I needed to protect something bigger than any one of us. But the illusion had cracked. The real motive wasn't greed or revenge. It was legacy, twisted by years of quiet sacrifice." Mrs. Penrose had spent decades scrubbing the floors of a house that had once exiled her for love. And when justice came knocking, she had chosen silence again, out of loyalty not to Walter, but to a memory that could not defend itself. As Mabel turned away, Miss Marple stepped forward once more. "There's still a chance to tell the truth," she said. "Let Richard be remembered rightly. Let Felix be found." Mrs. Penrose looked out the window, where the dusk was falling thick and fast. "Do you think that changes anything now?" "Yes," Miss Marple said simply, "because truth is the only thing left that Clara can't rewrite." There was no reply. Only the quiet clatter of a teacup settling in the drying rack, and the sound of a woman who had run out of lies worth keeping. The morning broke in brittle silence, the sky a dull steel over Hilltop Manor, and the wind carried a thin, biting edge that scraped across the windows like fingernails. Miss Marple moved through the house with a deliberate calm, her mind steady but sharp. There would be no more hidden compartments, no more scorched documents or whispered warnings in the dark. Everything was in place now, every lie catalogued, every motive unknotted, every face behind the mask finally seen for what it was. Today, it would end. She found Mabel in the breakfast room, clutching a half-full teacup with both hands. The girl's face bore the quiet exhaustion of someone who had carried too many secrets too long. "She knows," Mabel said without preamble. "Clara, she's watching everyone." Miss Marple gave a slow nod. "That's just as well. I want her to watch. Let her think she's still ahead." She spent the rest of the morning with the constable. She didn't offer accusations, only asked for presence, discretion. And when she returned, she sent word to Clara that she'd like to speak privately in the drawing room. The message was delivered by Mrs. Penrose, who said nothing but whose eyes lingered on Miss Marple a moment too long before she turned away. Clara arrived 5 minutes later, dressed with the usual precision. A navy blouse, hair pinned without fault, eyes sharp and cold. She took a seat in the high-backed armchair opposite the hearth and crossed her legs with composed indifference. "If this is another round of insinuation, Miss Marple, I'm afraid you'll find me entirely unwilling to play." "I don't intend to play," Miss Marple said, settling into her own chair. "I intend to close a chapter." Clara said nothing, her silence an invitation to proceed. "You orchestrated everything after the will changed," Miss Marple continued. "You believed the inheritance was yours by right. You found Felix's name, realized what it meant, and moved quickly to erase it. The break-in, the photograph, the forged trail of a man fleeing, all clever but not clever enough. What you didn't count on was Felix leaving behind more than memories. He left a record, a journal, a statement." Clara's brow didn't move, but her chin dipped almost imperceptibly. "I also know about Richard," Miss Marple said. "The third brother. The one your uncle erased. The one Mrs. Penrose married. His silence became her burden, and yours became the will." Clara let the silence hang for a moment, then leaned forward slightly. "You've stitched together a touching narrative, but you've made one mistake." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Only one?" Clara's lips lifted in something between a smile and a sneer. "There is no proof, no body, no signature, no record that Felix Harper was ever here." Miss Marple rose slowly and crossed to the window. "That's where you're wrong. You see, Felix was here, he was seen. And his last journal, his second journal, was in the tool drawer. You must have missed it. Or perhaps you thought Mrs. Penrose had already destroyed it." At that, Clara's expression cracked, just slightly. Miss Marple turned. "The constable is reading it now. He's also comparing the writing from the courier's final delivery log with the letter Felix left in the woods. The handwriting matches. The man who died in this house died bringing evidence meant to reach the courts." Clara stood abruptly. "Then you've nothing on me. I didn't kill him." "No," Miss Marple said evenly. "You only intercepted the parcel and laced the tea." Clara's mouth opened, but nothing came. "I have the stopper from the vial you used," Miss Marple continued, voice sharp as glass. "It was traced to a compound not sold in this region. The constable found an identical bottle among your discarded toiletries in the gardener's bin. You made one mistake. Mrs. Penrose thought to protect you, so she disposed of it quietly. But she never thought anyone would search her rubbish. Clara's voice snapped, cold and brittle. She had no right. She did everything for you, Miss Marple said. Just as you used her. You dangled the memory of Richard like a shield. You promised her silence, security. In return, she cleared your path, burned letters, poured poison, lied to the police. Clara's hands curled into fists at her sides. She was loyal. No, Miss Marple said calmly. She was afraid. But not anymore. She confessed this morning. Clara froze. She told me about the night Felix collapsed, about the coat, the satchel, how you took them and told her to stay quiet. She helped, yes, but you were the one who decided how far it would go. She thought Felix had left. You knew he hadn't. Clara took a step backward, hitting the edge of the mantel. Miss Marple approached her, voice quiet now. Where is he, Clara? A long silence. Then Clara's face twisted, not in fear, but in fury. I gave him a chance, she hissed. He came to that gate like he belonged here. Like none of it had happened. As if he could just walk in, take everything, ruin us. He said he didn't care about the money, but that's always how it starts. First the name, then the house. Then everything my father built. I told him to go. He wouldn't. He stood there, pathetic, shaking, so I gave him the flask. And then... Clara's eyes burned. I watched him stumble toward the trees. I thought if he passed out, he'd wake up humiliated. But then it rained. And the next morning, he didn't come back. I waited. But he didn't. Miss Marple stared at her, sorrow rising in her chest like cold water. And the coat? I went to find him, Clara whispered. But I only found the satchel. The coat was soaked. I burned it. I told Mrs. Penrose he'd run. She believed me. Because she had to. Footsteps echoed down the hallway. The constable appeared at the doorway, 2 officers behind him. Mabel stood further back, silent, gaze unreadable. Clara turned, a breath caught halfway to a scream, and took a step toward the door. But the constable was already between her and the hallway. Miss Marple stood very still as Clara's shoulders sagged. It was supposed to be mine, she said faintly. All of it. Miss Marple answered quietly. That's the tragedy, Miss Havisham. You believed. Legacy could be inherited, but it must be earned. The constable stepped forward. Clara didn't resist. And as she was led away, Miss Marple watched the door close gently behind them, like the end of a long, bitter chapter finally sealed. The manor was finally quiet, in a way it hadn't been for weeks. No rustling of watchers behind doors, no boots echoing in midnight corridors, no creaking floorboards trying to hide the weight of deception. Clara had been taken away. And with her, the facade of control that had gripped the household like a vice. Mabel stood in the hallway long after they were gone, as though waiting for something else to collapse. Miss Marple, ever composed, had returned to the study, not to tidy up, but to make sense of the fragments still left behind. Mrs. Penrose had not spoken much since her partial confession. She remained in the kitchen, silent, stooped, stirring a pot that no one had requested. She hadn't been arrested. Her involvement, though deeply entwined, had not crossed the line into deliberate violence. Still, the air around her was heavy, with a grief she could no longer justify. Miss Marple moved to the desk and began sorting the journals, placing them into a single bundle with careful hands. She meant to deliver them to Mr. Ellicott in the morning, along with her own notes. As She reached for the red journal Felix had kept. A loose page slipped out from the back, nearly falling between the floorboards. She bent swiftly and caught it before it could vanish. It wasn't like the rest, no hurried script, no reflections. It was a receipt. A folded form with 2 initials at the bottom, not Felix's, not Walter's. R.H. Miss Marple straightened slowly. The name Richard Havisham had been all but forgotten in the wake of Clara's downfall. A dead man, a silent man. But this receipt, dated just 6 months ago, was recent. Very recent. Her eyes scanned the contents. A cash withdrawal, modest, signed. For at a bank in Shoreditch under the name Harper. She moved to her chair, heartbeat settling into a slower, more cautious rhythm. Something didn't align. Felix had written that he never asked for the inheritance, only to clear his name. He'd lived quietly, anonymously, and had left behind a journal full of observations and fear, but little ambition. But what if Felix had never returned? The thought was sudden, sharp, unwelcome. But she let it in. She took the red journal again, flipping through its entries, looking not for the content but for the rhythm of the hand. Then she opened Richard's surviving correspondence, kept locked in the drawer Walter had hidden. The handwriting matched. Not exactly, but enough. Slant, stroke length, pressure. The difference between a man in mourning and a man pretending to be one. Richard Havisham hadn't died. He had come back as Felix Harper. Miss Marple rose from her chair with an almost painful clarity. Richard had disappeared decades ago after marrying beneath his station. Walter had denounced him, written him out of every document, spoken of him only in scorn. But Richard had lived on, as Harper, as the lost brother, as the man who had no rights, no voice, no past, until Walter, old and full of regret, sought to atone not for Felix, but for Richard. And Clara, blind in her anger, had mistaken him for Felix. She had acted on the wrong truth. The man she had drugged, the man she had chased into the woods, had been Richard all along. Miss Marple stepped quickly toward the door and found Mabel just outside, her face pale, startled by the sudden urgency in Miss Marple's step. "I need you to fetch Constable Reeves," Miss Marple said, voice low but steady. "Now. Tell him. The case isn't closed after all." Mabel didn't hesitate. She disappeared down the corridor. Miss Marple returned to the shed, the place where Richard, Felix, had spent his last conscious hours. She scanned the walls, the benches. She was looking for something different now. A trail, not of fear, but intent. In a wooden crate beneath the bench, she found it. A wrapped envelope addressed to R.H., only if all else fails. She opened. Inside were legal documents, an old deed, a private letter to Walter signed with an R, not an F, and most damning, a sworn statement requesting the reversal of a name change filed in 1949. Richard Harper, formerly Richard Havisham. He had come back to reclaim what had been denied him, not money, but a name. And Clara, never knowing who he truly was, had tried to silence him permanently. The constable arrived as the sun dipped low behind the trees, and Miss Marple laid out everything without flourish. The journals, the receipt, the letter, the signature. Reeves stared for a long moment before muttering, "So it wasn't Felix?" "No," Miss Marple said quietly. "It was Richard, the forgotten brother. Clara killed the one man whose claim was stronger than hers, and didn't even realize it." He shook his head slowly. "Will she still be charged?" "She will," Miss Marple replied. Only now it won't be for undermining a stranger's rights. It will be for destroying her own uncle. They returned to the manor together. In the foyer, Mrs. Penrose was waiting, as if she had sensed the shift. "It was him, wasn't it?" she asked. Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. Then she said, "You knew?" Mrs. Penrose gave a brittle nod. "I didn't want to. But when I saw him in the garden that night, I knew. He stood the same way, had the same hands. And he looked at me like he remembered. Why didn't you say anything?" "Because I loved him," she whispered. "And if he'd survived and come back, and then died again in this house at their hands, I couldn't bear it." Miss Marple reached out, rested a hand on the woman's shoulder. "He tried to come back. That's what matters now." By the next day the press had begun to circle. The constable gave no statements. Clara, upon hearing the truth in her holding cell, reportedly fell into a stunned silence and refused to speak for hours. She had destroyed her uncle and her cousin. The will would be re-examined. The court would determine how to honor the wishes of a man who'd once tried to make peace with the past. But for Miss Marple there was nothing more to wait for. She left Hilltop Manor that afternoon, her travel bag neatly packed, her umbrella tucked under one arm. As the carriage pulled away down the long gravel drive, she looked back once, only once, and whispered to herself, "Some houses inherit more than wealth. They inherit silence. And sometimes silence is the loudest legacy of all." The smoke from the village chimneys hung low that morning, the air thick with a damp chill that crept into the bones. At Hilltop Manor, the atmosphere remained eerily subdued, as if the house itself had grown weary of its own secrets. Constable Reeves stood at the front gate, speaking in clipped tones to an officer from the county. A transfer request was underway. Clara Havisham would be transported to London for formal arraignment, where new charges reflecting the death of Richard Havisham, not Felix Harper, were being processed, a charge that carried a far weightier consequence. Inside, Miss Marple stood in the drawing room once more, the same place where the tangled web had begun to unravel. She looked not at the fireplace or the worn rug, but at the window, now slightly ajar, the curtains stirring in the morning breeze. The air carried no satisfaction, only the stillness that follows a storm. Mabel entered quietly, closing the door behind her. Her face was drawn but resolute. "They're saying the trial will take weeks," she murmured. "Maybe longer." Miss Marple nodded. "The law takes its time, and time is what this house has had too much of." Mabel sat opposite her, a folded paper in hand. "This came for you, from the solicitor's office." Miss Marple took it and unfolded the page. A letter from Mr. Ellicott, short, factual. He confirmed the will was being revalidated with the new identity of the true beneficiary, Richard Havisham. Since Richard was legally dead and had left no heirs, the estate would likely fall under public trust, unless Mrs. Penrose, as his surviving spouse, filed a claim. An option that had not yet been taken, Miss Marple refolded the paper and set it aside. "She won't," she said simply. Mabel leaned forward. "What happens now?" "That depends," Miss Marple replied, "on whether we call this justice or simply an ending." But endings were never simple, especially not here. She stood, walked slowly toward the study, and paused at the door. She had left something there, something for clarity's sake, a simple map of events, dates, names. A final sorting of truth, Constable Reeves had reviewed it and admitted, not without a touch of sheepishness, that he hadn't seen half of what she had, because it had been there all along. The letter hidden beneath the flower pot. Why place it in such an illogical spot? Because it was meant to be overlooked. The burnt photograph. Why take it at all if it was easily replaced? Because the original showed not 2 men, but 3. And the third had been scratched out. Walter's subtle reshaping of the family, even in old photographs, was a clue. The cup in the shed had been odd, not for what it was, but for how clean it was. A shed cup should have been coated in dust. Instead, it gleamed. Recently placed. Clara had taken no chances. Her planning bordered on obsession, and the ledger. The moment Miss Marple spotted the wrong signature line, Felix instead of Richard, she'd known it wasn't a matter of inheritance. It was identity. Clara hadn't just tried to erase a claim. She'd erased a name, not knowing the name had changed to protect the man she feared. She turned to Mabel. Did she ever tell you why she hated him so much? Mabel looked down. She said he'd ruin everything, that he'd take what was ours. But he didn't want any of it, Miss Marple said softly. He wanted his name restored, that's all. Walter knew that. But Clara never asked. She assumed. And then she acted. Mabel looked up. Was there ever a chance he could have lived? Miss Marple didn't answer for a moment. Maybe, if someone had gone after him, if the dose hadn't been so strong, if the storm hadn't come. Mabel's voice cracked. She let him die. She made sure no one went looking, Miss Marple corrected. And when she found the body, she moved the evidence, burned the coat, hid the satchel, and told Mrs. Penrose a story she was too afraid not to believe. They were silent for a long time. The front door opened below. Voices, footsteps, the constable again. He stepped into the drawing room a few minutes later, removing his cap. She's gone. Mabel looked up sharply. Gone? Escaped, then. Wrote to the station, slipped out when they paused to refuel, disappeared into the fog. Miss Marple didn't flinch. They'll find her, he added quickly. They'll alert all counties. No, Miss Marple said, they won't. The room stilled. She's clever, Miss Marple continued, calculated. If she had a plan for the inheritance, she had a plan for this. She's likely had it for weeks, an identity ready, a place to vanish. If we're lucky, she'll run far enough to fall into someone else's jurisdiction. If we're not, she may already be gone for good. Mabel's eyes brimmed. She can't just leave, after what she did. Miss Marple placed a hand on her shoulder. Justice is not always a courtroom. Sometimes it's living with the truth, and Clara will never escape that. The constable left shortly after, and the manor, once again, fell into uneasy stillness. Outside, the fog thickened. Miss Marple stayed one more night in the guest room near the east wing. Not because she feared something unfinished, but because she wanted to be sure nothing else would vanish before morning. She sat at the writing desk with her journal open, the last page half filled. Some lies are told with malice, others with fear. But the most dangerous are those told with love. She closed the book and turned down the lamp. Behind her, the house breathed. Beneath its roof, the full truth had finally been spoken. But one part had slipped through the cracks, like so many before it, and that was the nature of justice. Sometimes swift, sometimes silent, and sometimes just out of reach. The sky over Havisham Green had cleared by morning. The fog had finally rolled back into the trees, as if it too had finished its part in the long, concealed drama that had unfolded across the manor's thresholds. Miss Marple stood at the front gate, suitcase in hand, her hat pinned against the breeze. She had said her farewells with the quiet efficiency of someone who never overstayed a solved case. But inside her mind, not everything had been tied with a neat bow. Justice, yes. Truth, perhaps. But finality. That was always the illusion. Mabel stood beside her, eyes glassy from more than the chill. Behind her, the manor loomed, its windows blank, its walls quiet. A house now free from a legacy it had never been brave enough to examine, now stripped bare of its ghosts. "Will they ever find her?" Mabel asked. Miss Marple didn't answer right away. "Clara is clever, cold but clever. It's not a question of if, but when. The world is smaller than it looks when you're hiding in it." Mabel nodded, but her fingers twisted the strap of her coat. "And if they don't?" "Then she carries it," Miss Marple said simply. "Every morning she wakes with it. Every night she dreams with it. That's its own form of justice." The carriage arrived. Miss Marple lifted her case, paused, and looked once more at the house. The windows were dull again, but one near the top, the old nursery, had its curtain drawn back slightly, though no one had been up there in years. She said nothing of it. Instead, she stepped into the carriage, and they rolled away down the gravel path. The trees passed in slow rhythm, their bare branches scratching across the morning sky like the pages of an old diary. Mabel remained standing at the gate long after the sound of hooves had faded. Inside the carriage, Miss Marple retrieved a folded envelope from her coat. It was the letter that had been found too late, the one from Richard to Walter, never mailed. Buried in the study drawer, she read it again now, not for facts but for tone. The language was calm, deliberate, but a line near the end stood out more clearly than ever before. "I will return only if I believe someone is ready to listen. If not, I will remain a shadow. You may control the legacy, Walter, but I still know the whole story." A curious choice of words. She read it again. Lips pursed. "You may control the legacy." Present tense. The letter was dated nearly a year before Richard's return to the manor. But what if he'd already been there? What if the return hadn't been a beginning but the end of something longer? What if Richard had been watching not just for weeks but for years? She recalled the flower pot, moved, then returned. The peculiar marks beneath the windowsill. The journal hidden in the tool drawer, wrapped too precisely, tucked too neatly. Those weren't the acts of a man fleeing a decision. They were traces of someone who knew the layout of the house intimately, who had made it a habit of observing rather than re-entering. A shadow. Her mind turned slowly, carefully, around one final piece. The photograph. The original, burnt. The copy, replaced. But not just replaced. It was altered, not erased. When the copy had been examined closely, it had seemed normal. But a photographic specialist from the solicitor's office had noted a subtle modification in the negative. The eyes of the middle brother, the one assumed to be Felix, had been darkened slightly. A strange, unnecessary touch, unless someone had wanted to conceal a resemblance. The receipt, the handwriting, the journal. What if Richard hadn't come back as Felix? What if Richard had never left? The thought settled like dust, slow and suffocating. There was a gardener once, long retired, quiet, lame in one leg, lived near the river's edge in a small shed Walter had built himself in the 60s. No one had mentioned him during the case. No one had thought to. Miss Marple tapped the envelope gently against her knee. The idea was impossible. But then again, so had much of what had happened at Hilltop Manor. And yet all of it, every misdirection, every burnt clue, every wrong assumption, had made perfect sense in hindsight. She tucked the letter away again, her expression unreadable. The carriage rattled into the village, the rooftop sloping low, smoke curling idly from chimneys. She stepped out and thanked the driver, her suitcase in hand. Outside the post office, an old man on a bench nodded to her. He had a trimmed grey beard and wore a cap drawn low over his brow. Nothing remarkable, except for the faintest limp in his right leg. He met her eyes for a brief moment, then looked away. She entered the post office. Inside, she posted the letter to Mr. Ellicott with a final note attached. One more revision may be necessary. Please keep the original signature safe. As she turned to leave, the woman behind the counter asked, "Solving more mysteries, Miss Marple?" "Just putting old ones to rest," she said with a smile. Outside, the bench was empty. She walked toward the corner, her pace steady. But in the back of her mind, the words lingered, echoing between memory and doubt. "You may control the legacy, Walter, but I still know the whole story." She wondered now if Richard had ever intended to stay, or if he had only returned to remind them all that some names once spoken could not be forgotten. The manor would go quiet again. The documents would settle in court. And Clara, wherever she was, would carry her silence. But Miss Marple knew. There was always something that didn't quite fit. Always one loose thread, and she would keep tugging if only to see what unraveled next.